Thank you very much, and hello everybody. Today's topic is explaining identity security and the acronym soup behind identity security. What is ISPM and why does it matter? Now, like the webinar description told you, the challenge we're facing here is that there seems to be a new acronym popping up, when one is explained. And today's focus is really to go through some of that pain and hopefully make some sense out of it. I'm coming in this with a specific opinion, and that opinion is colored by my background. So I've worked in the security side for my whole career, more or less. And when I went to work for a company that was more known for the identity assets, all of the people that I knew were very confused. They're like, why would you go play with the AD server in the basement somewhere when all the cool tools are here in the ivory tower? And I had to explain to them that the world's changing and your users are escaping your perimeter, your workloads are escaping your perimeter. Identity is becoming central to the security efforts. And that has become obvious over the last few years. So the acronym soup is horrifying. You have everything. You have your identity providers, identity as a service, IDaaS, then all the things that are adjacent to it, like identity governance or IGA, privileged access management or PAM, SSO that enables then, these identities to be used to connect to those modern applications in a seamless, way. But then you need to add MFA, multi-factor authentication, in order to protect those, accounts. Then all these accounts that you have everywhere, you need, your cloud providers, to be in sync. So you need CIEM for that. And then the events need to be funneled into SIEM, et cetera, et cetera. Now we added two more, ISPM and ITDR. So I wanted to start from that opinionated viewpoint and tell you a little bit about how I see the identity security and how we at Cisco tend to frame these conversations with our clients. So let's get started with that. First of all, the best way to think about identity security is to put it into the context of how security people are thinking about things. And I'm bringing out here the NIST Cybersecurity Framework 2.0, where you have different strategies and different functions. You want to identify threats, protect against those threats. Then if an attack is underway, detect that, then be able to respond to it and recover from it. And you need to be able to have governance around all of these processes and tie them all together. So if we think about identity security as a landscape, the things that we need to do is basically be able to protect against exploits leveraging human and machine identities, and be able to ensure that the users are who they say they are and do what they're authorized to do. So this is where you need to have the ability to identify the gaps, protect against those types of vectors of attack that are known in the space, detect when an attack is underway, and be able to respond and recover. So the two acronyms that are at the center of today's talk are ISPM and ITDR. So I want to start by saying these are made up things. All of the acronyms are made up. They're made up by analysts. They're made up by organizations that try to put frameworks around these things. They're made up by industry bodies, etc. And ultimately, we can agree or disagree on the terminology. Here's my framing for it. I see ISPM, or the Identity Security Posture Management, to be closely aligned to the beginning of this journey, meaning we need to be able to protect the human and machine identities, and to understand that you need to understand, is everything that you have in your infrastructure actually protected? You need to identify those elements and then set up the protection and see if there's gaps in that protection against those attacks that might be targeting those human and machine identities. So it's all about identifying and quantifying those risks. And therefore, I see that the ISPM as a acronym aligns most closely here to the NIST CSF framework, elements of identify and protect. So those are the two functions. You need to identify what the threats and gaps are, and threats and responses that you would need to take is different thing, right? So here it's all about identifying what the attack vectors are and then setting up the correct amount of protection against them. And you could think that the ITDR in its reference here, that's a little bit better defined, I think. And it's all about defending those tools and infrastructure against the attack. And in that defense, you would then need to be able to detect an attack that's underway and then have a response to it. And Gartner defines this as the overall collection of tools and best practice to defend identity systems. So that's broader. In that sense, ITDR in Gartner's world, I feel, encompasses both ISPM and ITDR. So that might be like the ITDR is a little bit broader concept than just the ISPM is, because it's all goes towards that detect, respond, and recover functions in the cybersecurity framework. So hopefully this will help clarify a little bit how we come to this question and how is it that we frame this conversation. Now, we need to talk about why do you need to do this in the beginning? What's the actual use case? Why do you care? So the challenge that we face here is really this. The challenge is that in 2023, in the Verizon's DBIR, the Data Breach Investigations Report, they found that 74% of the breaches involved the human element, including social engineering attacks, phishing to get the user to interact with something malicious, and directly targeting, the help desk, for example, for the social engineering, etc., to go for the lowest common denominator, which often is the reset path. So we'll talk about that a little bit later too. But the actual business problem that the customers are facing with this is that identity is now the new perimeter. We've succeeded in moving the industry to this point where identity is the new perimeter, but it means that identity is also now the new attack surface. You have to now manage those identity environments across multiple platforms. Whether you're using Microsoft Entra or Okta or whoever for your IDP, the truth is when you start scratching the surface, you often have multiple IDPs and multiple sources of truth of those users who go into those IDPs. And that's the thing that we have to solve. You need to think about this as identity intelligence that encompasses both ISPM and ITDR so that you can leverage this across the different tools that you have at your disposal then to respond to those attacks. And we'll touch on that a little bit on how we see, companies being able to do this in practice. Now, what does this mean? It means that from an attacker's perspective, why would you hack in when you can just log in? If I gain the credentials to users within your environment, I can just log in. That's the easiest path, and attackers always choose the easiest path. So what do we need to do here? We need to understand how these threat actors are actually operating. They usually do a lot of research. They understand your companies and your employees. They mine the LinkedIn to find the right targets, high-value targets. That doesn't always mean your CFO or CEO. They could be also your super administrators, system admins in general, employees, in accounts payable, network engineers. Depends a little bit on what they're after and what the ultimate goal is, but they need to understand, first of all, who these people are so that they can gain their credentials. The goal may be to, launch and launch a ransomware attack, exfiltrate specific data, get the particular target to wire money outside of the organization, all kinds of things that can happen if a threat actor gets these credentials. So if you look at this kind of like a path on how this happens, and this is kind of like going through that use case. For example, the user might just call into the help desk and start social engineering the help desk. Example of this would be voice cloning. And from there, once I've convinced the help desk to reset the target's MFA, I now have unfettered access within the organization to the target. If the reset is executed, then what I can do as a threat actor is then go inside the organization and start mining my way through there. For example, I could simply log in to your identity provider, and once I'm logged in, I can gain super admin rights, of that user within that IDP. I can now go create new identities, create new users, assign new permissions to those users, assign applications to this, new IDP like Amazon, Microsoft, any other services where they can then go and launch their attack, ransom the network, begin to shut things down, whatever those steps might be. So these are the building blocks here of getting actual global access within the organization to do the things that they want to do. And it often starts from that identity. That's the key. So the challenge here is that there's basically a blind trust, if you will, between the authentication and the access. So in today's environment, we're asking if the user can gain access. However, the advancements of these threat actors to obtain new user credentials and pivot, the question shouldn't be, can the user access? It should be, should the user get access? And the reality is no one really understands their perimeter and identity landscape fully. So it's neither, this access is basically something that is today kind of too broad in a way. And one way of understanding this is, understanding this invisible attack surface that lies beneath that surface. Once somebody is able to basically impersonate a user within an organization and get their rights and privileges, you need to think about the attack paths as basically a tree that then spreads from there. What can this user do if they get access to this point as a malicious user? So that's the thinking that you need to have. Instead of this blind trust to everything, you need to understand kind of like that least privilege model. We're going to the zero trust tenets here, and I'm sure you've heard too much about zero trust, so I won't utter those words again, hopefully today. But let's talk about this problem. So here's the identity security problem in basically three broad buckets. First of all, you have limited visibility. The identity infrastructure is often fairly opaque. You may not fully understand your own identity footprint, especially as it comes to things like guest accounts, service accounts, inactive accounts, account proliferation across multiple IDPs that may or may not be corporate authorized IDPs. There's often these shadow IDPs that you don't have full visibility into. And not having this centralized insight into the full identity world is really the key here in the identity security posture management. Getting that visibility and being able to manage that is key. So that lack of visibility will lead to a lot of false positives and false negatives in the threat detection and response side, on the ITDR side. So that's why you need to kind of consider both. The second issue here is frail protection. And by frail, we mean that you have subpar MFA coverage. There's an opportunity area for improvement. You can't tell that the authentication, is bad or blows. You need to be able to tell them that, hey, I've identified there's an opportunity for improvement here. So you have incomplete coverage and weak forms of multi-factor. And you have lack of device trust and identity verification. These are the things that we usually find in an organization. You may have corporate issued devices, but they're only in a subsection of the employees. You may have devices that support strong authentication into the device with, say, for example, biometrics, but not everybody has a laptop, from the last few years, and you have these gaps. You can't also employ all of these same tools that you would for a corporate employee to any of the extended enterprise. So all of your partners who need access, vendors who need access, etc. So you need to start thinking about what is the actual level of visibility and trust you have on the users and the devices and their security posture. And that becomes brittle if you're trying to enforce, for example, I only grant access to this asset if you're on a corporate managed device. You need to oftentimes step back from that, saying, I actually can't enforce that because I also have these contractors and these third parties who need access to it. And I can't enforce this on everyone because I don't manage their devices. So this often becomes an issue. And the last third bit here is the enforcement. The enforcement itself is often coarse. It's a static access policy. You block or allow, and it's basically a blunt instrument. Those static access policies get in the way of responding to the risk that's actually present, and that's an issue. So what do we actually propose then? Well, we propose that you need to reimagine this identity-based trust. And one way of thinking about that is to say, let's look at what this next-gen authentication could look like. And in our vision, that next-gen authentication needs to include passwordless, cryptographically secured, and ultimately biometrically verified authentication. And by biometrics, that often doesn't mean that you need to have some kind of a massive, great central biometric system that you connect everyone to. It's more like, let's leverage what we have. We have devices. We have devices that support strong authentication and biometric verification. We have standards that allows us to basically verify a cryptographic digest from that endpoint, saying this was actually biometrically verified. It's not about saying this is the bootstrapping of your identity and identity verification. That's a slightly different problem. We can touch on that as well. But this is more about, hey, I'm coming back and claiming that I'm still me that you gave credentials to. I'm still Sammy. And this allows me to verify that, hey, I am in possession of the device that you verified me on. I can cryptographically prove that it's it is me who is using that device. So now you can look at the device and say, I recognize that device, and you get the information that, hey, it was the same person who cryptographically authenticated to that device. That's pretty strong. So these kind of starting points are great. Next, you need to understand the telemetry. The authentication should be AI and data driven. AI here is not just vendors sprinkling AI sauce on their solution. It is actually understanding the behavioral aspects of the user. And that behavior comes from the relationships that you can detect on the how the user accesses, what do they access, what are the interconnections between those devices and entities and sources to that access across the whole ecosystem of many, many vendors. And this is a non-trivial problem. And there's a specific way of approaching it that we'll touch on next. And then, of course, going back to that forbidden word, zero trust, you need to continuously monitor this trust over the full lifetime of the session. It's no longer enough to simply say, hey, they authed this morning. There was an authn event. They passed. They knew the password. They put in the OTP, and we are good to go. The continuous monitoring means that we also need to look at it and say, hey, are there any indicators of compromise? Was that particular authentication maybe coerced because that user was targeted in an attack and they got through by basically MFA exhaustion or MFA flood, making the user basically submit and say accept, but by basically just exhausting them? Or was this a session that started on their device but now appears to be coming from a different device, which indicates that this session was hijacked? Maybe there was malware on that endpoint, or maybe the session has indications that it's coming through a proxy and it's an adversary in the middle attack. All these kind of things are important to understand through the whole life cycle, through the whole lifetime of the session. Whether that session is a SaaS session lasting for a day, or if that session is, say, for example, a session that you gave to a thick client application that's good for a month. Those are the scary ones, especially for business email compromise. So what do we do? Instead of this blind trust between authentication and access, we say remove that blind trust and better understand and monitor those activities in the middle by putting analytics in there. So authentication leads to analytics that leads to access. And this is a case for identity intelligence as a kind of a superset, if you will, of both ITDR and ISPM. So this connection here is what we're talking about. And the case that we're making for identity intelligence is that you have many identity data sources, both as IDPs and as sources of the users in the lifecycle management process of your system, whether they're HR search systems or simply rogue directories, or let's call it legacy forgotten directories that aren't fully baked into the whole identity ecosystem. And most organizations of any size are missing this unified view of all those users: internal users, that is employees; external users, such as business partners and other portals that you might have to extend outside of your enterprise; contractors, all of these service accounts, etc. And you have poor visibility into the activities of these entities. What are the users and the devices actually doing? Why am I seeing this one device being used as an MFA device for 20 different users when it's a phone? What's going on here? These are the kinds of patterns that emerge that are very, very curious. And you need this comprehensive approach to both ISPM and ITDR, where you can look at the user inventory, monitor those non-employee accounts, understand the MFA adoption and usage, which MFA factors are actually being used and by whom, getting the full reporting and analytics across these stacks, no matter what the vendors are behind those IAM systems. And then being able to start diving in, do some discovery, do some threat hunting, if you will, within the identity security space. And then have something that allows you to do continuous threat detection and take action on those threats as you see them. That's identity intelligence. Now, the world where the users are, you probably are invested in multiple sources. Even if you're a Microsoft shop, there's a good chance that you have other sources. This won't change, and this is where identity intelligence comes in, where you can deploy something where, without putting agents everywhere, you can basically just use APIs and get the data from all these technologies out there, IDPs, ISPs, like these here. And the best way to do that is to basically build a platform that allows you to ingest this information and start building out this kind of a map or a graph of the users, machines, services, apps, and data and behaviors across all of these. And that's what we propose as the best approach to ITDR ISPM. At Cisco, we've built this. It's something we call the Cisco Identity Intelligence. And this is basically an underlying technology. It's not a product. It is basically coming to you as part of these different tools and services that we offer. For example, at Cisco, you would be able to get this benefit through Cisco Duo, Cisco XDR, Cisco Secure Access, etc. The commonality here is the behavioral analytics around the posture and user behavior that then informs these tools to perform specific actions like understanding the inventory, analytics, being able to stop and challenge users as appropriate. This identity graph basically then gives you a map, the relationships that users have, the locations, the factors for authentication that they're using, the relationships they have, brings in the information from HR systems like Workday and others. You see the machines on the networks, their identities, the past key sessions, visibility into services, the data they're accessing, apps and platforms they're engaging in. That's the identity graph. And here's an example. By doing this, we can then do things that are interesting. So let's look at an example. We can assess the behavior across the organization, like here, Greg. Now, the intelligence system here sees that Greg all of a sudden was added to the database admin group and is now accessing and looking at the Oracle customer database. Now, this information we can then feed into tooling inside Cisco like Duo, so you can now go in and make changes immediately and remove Greg from the database admin group if that wasn't intentional. So if you see this kind of an access where all of a sudden a change was made that didn't come from an expected source, you can act on that. Another example would be session hijacking. So here we see, for example, that these kind of things are hard to defend against because the session token is associated with a valid user. It's like somebody stole your driver's license. The credential is valid, it's just in the wrong hands. And unlike driver's license, There's no ID component to that token. Token is bearer token. It's like you have a bearer bond in your hand, like, from the 80s heist movies, right? So here, if a session is hijacked and they're now accessing SharePoint, you'll be able to look at it and say, this looks suspicious because it's coming in, with a discrepancy. The session hijacking is a situation, for example, if a threat actor sent a phishing email to Greg interacted with that email, the threat actor could see what Greg is seeing through that hijacked session, for example, going to SharePoint. Now, this can also then communicate out to other products. So here we don't have to have the ability to see, for example, that a specific path was done on an endpoint to get to that session token. We can see the token being used from multiple places, and that's how we can detect that. Another area we're looking at is outdated permissions. For example, in this example, we've identified that Greg has his old IBM ThinkPad. It probably hasn't access to the network in some time, and its location was Mexico. Now, we can give the visibility to organizations so they can go and remove that point of entry that equates to unnecessary risk. We can see that he had a trial to Zendesk, and then that expired. So we may want to remove that trial to that application. So we can understand this kind of like attack surface that's lingering, that's no longer relevant to the user. Similarly, we want to look at these kind of like outdated permissions in a broader sense, for all of these systems, like configuration of the multi-factor authentication, and eliminate these kind of threats as well. So if you have no MFA configured, we see that the user is coming from a location where they can't possibly be at the same time as they were 15 minutes earlier. We can see what authentication methods were being used, and we may see this and take action on all of these. So the whole idea here is to be able to do this continuous assessment and do this in a lightweight manner where you just instrument these underlying systems through existing APIs, which makes it very quick to deploy because there's no software to install. This is all cloud service. And we just tap into the existing APIs of this underlying ecosystem to then build this identity graph and be able to act on all of these elements. As I go along, if you do have any questions on any of these matters, just feel free to put them into the Q&A box on your portal, and I'll be happy to answer those toward the end as well. Okay, so if we think about this, then, how do we infuse all of this data and information, and what do you actually should be able to do with this? So we want to give you a quick glimpse into the kind of tooling that can take advantage of this kind of intelligence. You can build your own, of course, or you can, use ours, if you have tooling that is, one that, you already have from us, for example, that makes sense, like Cisco Duo or XDR or firewalls. Let me give you some ideas here on where this identity intelligence can come into play. Let's look at the user protection, cloud protection, and breach protection, specifically. So it maps to authentication, secure access, and extended detection and response, or XDR. In this model, for example, how would this make authentication smarter within the Cisco Duo? Well, we can discover and improve and enhance the actual risk-based access analytics and understand the security posture, then monitor the compliance requirements and improve the MFA efficacy by making sure that the right factors are actually getting deployed to the users, and improve the adoption rate of those user groups where we see lagging indicators of that. So the idea here is that then you can go and share this detection of unusual patterns based on behavior and third-party signals, and then reduce the breach risk by having the centralized identity visibility and control, and gives you, better security posture by protecting the access and identity infrastructure by understanding from the ISPM perspective what configurations are in place. So this touches on both sides of that. The smart authentication here means that from the multi-factor auth side, You understand the username, the password, the biometric, the location, the network, and the device. Now, with this identity intelligence, we can inform you that an admin role has been assigned. We authenticate, we understand all of this behavior, and then see that something unusual took place. Admin role was assigned, there's an unusual action that's been taken. Now we allow doer to make sure this authentication is flagged for further action, like failed auth or step-up auth at this point. Smart access. How did this make access better with secure access? So here we can verify the authentication decision and block any unusual or high-risk behaviors and expose these subtle shifts in the identity posture. So this is essentially zero trust readiness. Protect the entire network from account takeovers and look at the subtle shifts in identity posture, not just for humans, but for the machines, services. And then we can go back and challenge. If you look at this here, the unusual identity behaviors based on the risk would be then challenged, within the Cisco secure access. Track those changes, empower the administrators to create access policies so you can block and challenge the activity based on that risk. So it's all behavioral and risk-based. Here, for example, an authentication usually goes through an access path, and you're able to access these private traditional, SaaS or internet access apps, directly. But by building the Cisco Identity Intelligence into the secure access, we can then add smarter access things like saying, hey, are you using legacy MFA or is this a dormant account? And this allows you to go and deny access in situations that are highly unusual. Like somebody has had access to an account and they haven't used it in over a year, you might basically put brakes on those kind of accesses. That way people can't mine these legacy accounts and target them later. And then lastly here on this path, we can talk about smart threat defense. This is an interesting one. This relates to the extended detection and response. So the idea is to expand the XDR capabilities to respond to identity-based attacks that could involve data extortion, compromised credentials. And we get these identity signals with endpoint and network security signals. We integrate them together. So you're already getting the endpoint and network security signals into your XDR from all of the infrastructure that you already own. The Cisco XDR has extensive integrations into the leading tools, not just what we make, but what they are the leading vendors in the industry. And this expands that understanding of the security incidents with this user context. And if you ask any SOC operator, often the identity IDP logs and that data that they mine there is very rich. It's very informative. Because it includes things that you can detect at the time of the auth and attempt. This makes the defense for these threats smarter. We can now look at the user behavior and their access and the posture of that user from the web, the endpoint itself, the network, and this gives you the ability to analyze and correlate all of these to include identity detections into the incidents and the attack chain. So now you can tie the kill chain and the attack chain together, understand where you can then stop this attack. This is great context, both for the inventory and the value scores of all these identities, and helps with this threat hunt and investigation in the XDR world. And you get basically a higher fidelity event signal, and it helps automation and response. And whether you're doing automated or guided or manual intervention, this is super valuable. The outcome of the AI in real time, if you will, here. These are not event logs as they're rarely used in detection. That's difficult to do. This is real time detection and response. So with the smart threat detection, the idea here is extend that detector response. In the past, it's been endpoint and network, but now we include identity context. For example, we might see that all of a sudden we're seeing an MFA flood attack where a user's primary credential has been compromised. Maybe they reused their password and now the attacker realized that that primary credential they have now that can be used, and all that's stopping the successful attack is now MFA. If the MFA is based, say, for example, on traditional push or OTP, you can just exhaust the user with that MFA push. And here we would see that when we add to that endpoint and network signals, that identity signal, where we see unusual app access after an MFA flood attack and then an admin role assigned to the user, this is all of a sudden a critical thing that was seeing nothing from the endpoint and network perspective. So adding this third leg into that threat detection on XDR is extremely valuable. So if you think about the identity now as then your new security perimeter, it should be pretty obvious why we're going to use this identity intelligence to power all these different products within a security portfolio. And if you look at this, from our perspective at Cisco, the Cisco Duo gets smarter conditional access based on this identity intelligence data and detections, and then passwordless deployment dashboard, see where passwordless is actually being used. And then the data that Duo has is fed into the identity intelligence for visibility and detections. On the secure access side, you get adaptive access based on this identity intelligence, and the behavior and user information, again, is feeding in as well. And on the XDR side, the XDR data set is now richer because you now have that user context in addition to the network and device context. And again, ITDR detections in XDR can be used then for correlation and stitching. If we dive in a little bit here, the way we think about the actual risk here is something that we did a study on. We looked at cybersecurity readiness and found that about 75% of the companies believe an incident will disrupt their business in the 12 months. And only 3% of the companies were mature enough to protect against the security threats. 80% are moderately to very confident in their ability to defend against modern threats. So there's a big discrepancy here, right? 11% of companies see AI-related cyber threats among the top 3. We really see that you should no longer be asking, can you have access, but should you have access? Now, what are the reasonable next steps? What can you do, and how does this all work? I want to show you two things. I wanted to show you kind of like an architecture on how this works, and then talk about next steps that an organization can take and what you can do to learn more about these things. So here, the next slide shows you kind of like that architecture. Here we see data sources like identity providers on the left. They might be Microsoft Entra ID, AD, Google, Okta, Auth0, Duo, whatever the identity source is. You have HR systems like SuccessFactors or Workday, device management frameworks like Intune, etc. Applications that have their own identity silos often still within them and direct access enabled like GitHub or Salesforce, AWS as the most common ones, where we see people where they are always forced to go through SSO, but can also log in direct, which is often a blind spot. And then threat feeds, whether they're standard sticks and taxi format threat feeds or specific ones like ipinfo.io. You take all of this data, both the static data, and static in the sense that they're defined like users, groups, apps, devices, factors, etc., change logs and events, and the event streaming, and you flow them into the posture management, which is MFA-less, dormant, overprivileged accounts and unified view of all the users, understand what those look like. And then the detection and response, where you can have the specific tactics and techniques and procedures for detecting and monitoring. And then take action, both in ITSM perspective, like, using ServiceNow or similar tools, or by taking action by alerting people through messaging platforms like Teams and Slack and WebEx and email, and also by pointing out for the operators direct paths to mitigation remediation, like go fix this issue in Entra, or go and make this change in the Okta group, for example, or change this Duo deployment configuration, make sure that you enforce this factor for everyone in this group. That's the basic idea on how you can take this kind of a broader approach, combining the ISPM posture management into the threat detection and response operational aspect of it. Now, if you take a look and see then what are the steps that you can do to understand where you would be yourself in your organization for this particular thing, if this is something that you're curious about, then you can get an identity security assessment. It's basically a short-term assessment that requires no coding, no integration, that evaluates the IAM hygiene, identifies in your environment any specific places where there's no or weak MFA, dormant accounts, overprivileged users, etc., and gets you a view of all those identities with activity and device mappings. It'll also give you insight into identity-related attacks that might be underway in your organization without your direct knowledge right now, and then gives you a snapshot of the alignment, how this aligns into the compliance and security frameworks that you may be interested in. Maps it into the CIS framework, into the MITRE ATT&CK framework, looks at it from that NIST CRF perspective, cybersecurity framework, CSF framework, PCI compliance, framework for payment card related, anything that in your system is, in scope for PCI compliance, and then of course SOC standards. And also license usage, because sometimes it's interesting to also see that you have over-provisioned access to accounts that are never being used, and you basically had an opportunity to downsize certain licensing within your environment for users who don't actually need that access anymore or never did. So these are some things that we can do for you. If you're interested in this, feel free to reach out. We do this, kind of assessment free of charge, and happy to help you with those. Now, I wanted to pause here and switch over to see if we have any questions in the queue. And if you have any questions, feel free to put them in here. And here's one. I'll start with this one, and feel free to add more as you have them. The question is, this seems somewhat overwhelming. Do I need to change my IDP when I deploy? The answer is no. This is designed basically to be very low touch. If you take this approach to identity intelligence, you can simply give us credentials in a form of an API access key to all of those IDPs you already have, whether it is local, whether it is Microsoft, Okta, or Zero, any of the other ones. And we basically tap into those and make this assessment for you. There's another question. This is about zero trust. How does this align to the zero trust approach that I have been hearing about? I would say that the identity security in general and ITDR specifically is central to any zero trust effort, in the sense that in all the zero trust frameworks, identity is usually the first pillar of zero trust. You need to understand how do you give the right user the identity, the right level of access to the right resource at the right time in the right context, and monitor that continuously. This ties the beginning, middle, and the end together. This gives you the way to basically validate and verify that what you are deploying from security perspective meets those zero trust building blocks and those pillars, and allows you to start leveraging identity as the new security perimeter and seeing more clearly when that identity as the security perimeter is under attack. All right. It looks like there are no more questions in the queue right now. So with that, thank you very much for joining us today, and have a nice day.